Sil poly, sil nylon, or Dyneema, which is the best material for your tarp? It depends from person to person, varying on how they're going to use their tarp and also what their budget is. In this video, I'm going to give you some information so you can make more of an educated decision on which material to go with. Okay, so what I have here is I have some orange sil nylon, this green sil poly, and then I got two different weights of DCF, Dyneema composite fabric. This is also used to be called Cuban fiber. So if you hear somebody talking about Cuban fiber, they're talking about DCF. So one thing that you might see in the description when you're thinking about ordering a tarp from us or from other manufacturers is the weight. Like the description might say it's a 1.1 ounce sil poly or sil nylon, or it might say it's a 1.6 ounce sil nylon. So what that is referring to is the weight of the material per yard. 1.0 sil nylon weighs 1 ounce per yard. A 1.6 weighs 1.6 ounces per yard. To give you an idea of the weight for a tarp, the typical, and I'm going off a 12-foot ridge line. I personally prefer 11, but 12-foot ridge line. A typical hex tarp takes 8 yards of material. A typical winter tarp with doors with the 12-foot ridge line takes about 10 yards of material. So that kind of gives you a baseline of how much it's going to weigh. You know, hex tarp 8 yards. Are you using a 1 ounce per yard fabric, or are you using a 1.6 ounce per yard fabric? You know, along that lines. Now, a winter tarp weighing 10 yards, taking 10 yards of material to make a winter tarp, and you might say, well, I'm using a 1 ounce material, so that tarp's going to weigh 10 ounces. That's not true, because I did some research on some of the other companies to get an average, and a 12-foot ridgeline winter tarp with doors, on average, with sil nylon or sil poly, weighs 20 to 22 ounces. And that's because you got to take that 10 yards of material and then cut it to shape and everything, and then by the time you put it, do all the sewing, the reinforcement panels, the gross gain, on and on and on. When you're talking about ounces, this weight adds up very quickly. So that's how you can take 10 yards of material at roughly 10 ounces of material to make a winter tarp, and then by the time you're done, it's weighing 20 ounces because of all that material adds quickly. So the hex tarps, they're called hex tarps because if you lay them flat, they look like a hexagon. You got rectangular tarps and hex tarps, and then you have the winter tarps with doors, which is basically a hex tarp with doors. One thing to keep in mind when ordering the fabric is the difference between sil poly and sil nylon. I'll get into the DCF in a minute, but sil nylon is, the advantage to it is it's tougher. It can handle a little bit more abuse. Both of them have a ripstop grid in the fabric, but the sil nylon, the ripstop grid is better. So if you get a tear in the sil nylon, it might just make a small little tear that could be pretty easily repaired. You get a tear in a sil poly tarp, and it could just make a big long rip down your tarp, and you might be able to repair it, but chances are you might have to just scrap it. So that's the advantage of sil nylon over sil poly. One of the disadvantages of sil nylon over sil poly is it does absorb some water. Sil poly will absorb a very minimal amount of water. Sil nylon absorbs quite a bit, and the DCF doesn't absorb any water at all. And that's why, like if you've had a sil nylon tarp or a sil nylon tent, which most tents, other than the Cuban fiber tents, or Dyneema tents, Most tents are a nylon-based material. That's why you got to let them out. If they've been out in the rain all the time, all night, you got to let them dry out for quite a while to really get them dry. Because it does absorb water. Perfect example of this is I took my Sil Poly tarp and I lent my nephew my Sil nylon tarp. We did an overnight backpacking trip, and it rained on us that night. And that morning we were waiting under a pavilion, waiting to be picked up. So we went ahead and hung our tarps up underneath the pavilion out of the rain. And within an hour or so, my Sil Poly tarp was dry, and I was able to pack it away with no problem. But the Sil nylon tarp, it was definitely drier, but it was still holding water. You could see, I mean, it was still wet and still. So when I got home, I had to hang it out to dry for a few more hours to get it all good and dry before I packed it away. So Sil nylon does absorb a noticeably larger amount of water than Sil Poly. Sil nylon will still keep you dry, but the material itself does absorb water. So the drying time for Sil nylon is greater than the drying time for Sil Poly, which could really come to an effect if you're backpacking, doing a several-day trip, and you have to take your tarp and pack it back in your bag and carry it. The Sil nylon, when it's wet, is going to weigh more than the Sil Poly because it's holding more water. Another disadvantage to the Sil nylon tarps is they stretch, especially when they're wet. They tend to stretch out some. That's how come sometimes with a tent or a tarp, especially a tarp, if you have a nylon tarp, you might have to get out and retighten the lines a couple times. You might think the lines are keep loosening up, but they're staying tight. In most cases, it's the material itself that's stretching, and that's causing the flapping and stuff in your tarp because it's stretching. It was just making it loose. So one thing you could do is on a Sil nylon tarp, I would not buy a Sil nylon tarp that did not have cat curves. And cat curves, it's short for catenary curves. So what you do is if you took your hex tarp, and this is a side view, if you had it cut straight like that on the bottom, and your tie outs are coming out here, and this is your ridge line, if you had it cut straight across the bottom, this material right here is going to be really hard to keep tight. You're going to notice it's flopping and round and wind, and especially if it's wet. But even when it's dry, it's going to be hard. You can try repositioning your lines and everything, but this material here is going to be hard to keep tight. And the bigger the gap is from here to here, the worse that will be. So with a cat cut, what it is the material is cut like this, and that allows that really makes a big difference on being able to keep this tight and keep this from flopping around and everything. And if you see the tarp has a cat cut, it might say it's got a 2-inch cat cut or a 4-inch cat cut or 3-inch cat cut or whatever. What they're talking about is, imagine, if you had an imaginary line through here and you measured from here to the highest point of the cat curve. If it's a 2-inch cat cut, that means that distance is 2 inches. If it's a 5-inch cat cut, that distance is 5 inches. You can definitely get away with a smaller 2-inch cat cut on most Sil Poly tarps. With the Sil, you could definitely get away with like a 2-inch cat cut on most Sil Poly tarps. But with the Sil nylon, you're looking at 4 inches, 5, 6 inches, to really make it so you can get it nice and tight is what I would go with. I would go with at least a 4 on a Sil nylon. But the disadvantage of, like a 2-inch cat cut on a Sil Poly versus a 2-inch or 4-inch cat cut on a Sil nylon is you're losing more coverage, you know. I mean, a couple inches, if the distance between here to here, going from 2-inch to 4-inch, that's not that much. You're not going to lose that much coverage, but you do lose some. So that's something to keep in mind. Another thing that you could do besides the cat cuts with a seal nylon tarp is get some shot cord here where the top, where your lines tie out to, and attach this shot cord, elastic cord, to the tarp itself, and then attach your line to that. And so whenever you tighten your line up, it's stretching that shot cord out. And then as your tarp starts to stretch from being hung up, or especially if it gets wet, that shot cord will keep everything tight. So if you buy a seal nylon tarp, see if they already have some kind of shot cord attached to it. If not, that'd be something you might want to do. It makes a really big difference having shot cord on a seal nylon tarp. And if you look around, there's other ways you can do it. You can attach the shot cord farther down your tie out lines, and there's a lot of different ways, but shot cord somewhere between your stake and the tarp really helps a seal nylon tarp. Seal poly, I do it on my seal poly tarps, because they do stretch a little bit, but the main reason I put it on is if somebody trips over my line, it protects my tarp a little bit, because if I just had that line going from the stake right to my tarp, everything's nice and tight, and they trip over and hit that line, something's, you know, stake's going to get pulled out, the line's going to break, the tarp's going to, something's going to give, and I don't want it to be my tarp. So having that shot cord in there, even on my seal poly, I do that. There are disadvantages to seal nylon over seal poly. You know, seal nylon absorbs more water, which increases the weight of it. When it's packed away wet, it takes longer to dry, and it does stretch more than seal poly. But seal poly does absorb some water, which makes it a little bit heavier when wet, and it does stretch a little bit, but not as much as this seal nylon. But the big advantage to seal nylon is it can take more abuse. It's a lot more durable. The rip stops in there a lot better and everything. The price wise between seal poly and seal nylon, they're really, really similar. I mean, there's really not much price difference at all between the two. If you're going to be laying the tarp on the ground to fold it up and all that kind of stuff, I would seriously consider seal nylon. And also, like when you're dragging the seal nylon, you know, you're stretching it up and you're dragging across the line on any tarp. If you're dragging across the ground, it can get caught on a little stick or a thorn or something and cause a tear. I'd much rather get a tear in a seal nylon tarp than a seal poly, because it's going to do more damage to the seal poly. I keep my seal poly tarps in a tarp snake skin. You can Google them and find out more about them. I have a video I'll post at the end of this. It shows how to make a DIY tarp snakeskin for $1. So I use that on my seal poly tarps, so they never touch the ground. So I don't have to worry about that. If I was going to be, especially like if you're bushcrafting and all that kind of stuff, or if you're just going to be using your seal nylon tarp, I mean, you're going to be using your tarp for a lot of different things. Seal nylon, it's tougher material. You might really want to consider that. Backpacking, because it absorbs less water, and if you have to put it away in your pack wet and then walk another 10 or 15 miles, I would kind of consider seal poly. If you get a seal poly tarp snakeskin, that's the way to go. I would definitely get I like them for convenience no matter what tarp I'm using, but if I'm using a seal poly tarp, definitely have it in a tarp snakeskin. So that's seal poly, seal nylon. The heavier weight stuff, like this is my tarp, and my winter tarp with doors. And this bag, instead of seal poly 1.0 ounce, I used a 1.6 ounce, and it's a lot heavier material. I'd trust that more to take abuse than I would the 1.0 seal poly. So on to the DCF, Dyneema composite fabric. And what it is this guy has a bunch of strands. I don't know if you're going to be able to see them in there or not, but there's a bunch of strands of fabric in there. I mean, strands of this material, which is the Dyneema itself. You kind of see them in there, them white strands. So those white strands of Dyneema they lay out some laminate, and then they crisscross those strands of Dyneema and sandwich it in between two layers of laminate. And those strands of Dyneema, if you had a piece of steel cable the same diameter as those strands would be 15 times stronger than the steel would be. So really strong, really strong material. It's used a lot in sailboats and stuff like that, and so it doesn't absorb any water at all. You could basically, if your tarp was up in the rain and you had to pack it away, once the rain quit, you could just take a towel and dry it off. The material itself is not going to absorb any water. So that's all good with that. And they make a Dyneema repair tape. So if you got a hole in it or whatever, you could just patch that hole with that Dyneema tape, and it's just as good as new. The tape won't peel off. It makes it just as waterproof. So repairing Dyneema is really, really easy. So this is a 0.51 ounce material. This is what most tarps Dyneema tarps are made out of. This is a 1.0 ounce Dyneema. It's quite a bit heavier. A lot of this is used for like roll top bags and stuff like that. And then on tent floors, they might make the tent out of this 0.51, but the tent floor is usually something heavier, at least a 1.0, but usually like a 2.92 or whatever. Everybody talks about how super, super light Dyneema is compared to steel poly and steel nylon. Well, of course, if you're using a 1.0 ounce material on these, and then using a 0.51 ounce material on the Dyneema, you're basically half the weight. So that's a really big advantage. That's the reason why so many people go with Dyneema, because of the lightweight of it. One downside, and you wouldn't think it is, but this doesn't pack as small as steel poly or steel nylon. I've seen some steel poly tarps compared to Dyneema tarps, and with them in the stuff sack, the Dyneema tarp is almost 1.5 times bigger than a steel poly tarp. So one disadvantage to Dyneema is it doesn't pack as small. It's not as compressible. So that's something to keep in mind. Another thing people don't like about it is, as you can see, it's transparent. Now, if you're in your tarp and you're camping around other people and you're changing clothes or whatever, and you want a little bit of privacy, you're not going to get much. But realistically, when the tarp's set up and everything, you're not changing clothes like this. You're back away from it and everything, and all you can really see is like a silhouette of the person. I mean, you can't really see any graphic details of somebody changing clothes or anything. But it is an issue that a lot of people don't like about Dyneema. And of course, the heavier weight fabric is not as transparent, but it still is transparent. And another thing is, early in the morning, or like when it gets dark late at night, either way, if you're trying to sleep and it's daylight, that light's going to come right through your tarp and wake you up. If you're sensitive to light when you're sleeping, it'll definitely wake you up. So that's a disadvantage. Just not a lot of privacy. And like I said, when you're in a tarp and you're back away from it, you really can't see much. Just kind of like a silhouette. You can see a person moving, but that's about it. The lack of privacy in a Dyneema tarp and the sunlight coming through, those are disadvantages to Dyneema. The biggest advantage is lightweight and super, super waterproof material. It just will not absorb any water. And disadvantage, the biggest disadvantage to this is, for a hex tarp with one of these, Sil nylon or sil poly, they're gonna have more or less $100. Hex tarp with one of these, you're getting into a couple hundreds of dollars. Winter tarps, $130, $150, $60 for these. Winter tarps with doors for Dyneema, you're looking at over $300. I've seen some over $400. And the reason that is the cost. These materials here, sil nylon and sil poly, cost on average about $7 a yard. Dyneema can cost anywhere from $17 to $23 for a half a yard. So the cost is just crazy on this Dyneema, and it's hard to get too. And a lot of places around the country are experiencing shortages and expect to experience shortages of this throughout this year of 2022. So that's just a little bit of information on different tarp materials, what, you know, like what the numbers mean, 1.0, 1.6, advantages and disadvantages in the different materials. Sil nylon, if you know your tarp's gonna take some abuse, or you're afraid it will, sil nylon I think would be the way to go. Backpacking, I would and the chance of having to pack it away wet and carry it the next day, sil poly would be something to consider. Definitely have it in a snakeskin. If you got the money and you're doing some serious miles backpacking and everything, Dyneema, the DCF fabric. If all you're doing is car camping and everything, unless you just have a lot of money you want to spend for car camping, or maybe you're just hiking a mile or so, I would definitely not go with Dyneema. I mean, $300 or $400 for a dang tarp. To me, it's not worth it. If you got that kind of money, then go for it. One thing with like the Amazon tarps, you could find a lot of good, like my Chill Gorilla, my Kelty Noah tarp, really nice tarp, really durable. It's made out of nylon, and it's about $70. Where these, you know, you're going to spend $100 or more. But it's a heavier material. And even though on those cheaper tarps like Amazon and stuff like that, they might say they might have a silicone coating. Like this sil nylon is a siliconized nylon, that sil poly is a siliconized polyester, but they have silicone impregnated into the material and everything on both sides. You can use the tarp flipped one way or the other, it doesn't matter. A lot of the tarps you find on Amazon, they just have a silicone spray coating on it, and it's usually just on one side. It doesn't hold up and last as long, the waterproofness of it, you know, over time it will definitely start leaking. So that's something to take into consideration when looking at those cheaper tarps. You know, the silicone is impregnated on both sides on these materials. But Amazon tarps, it's basically just a silicone spray that they coat one side of it with. And while my Kelty Noah tarp has been good for a couple of years, it's still going good. It's not going to hold up. The waterproofness is not going to hold up like it will on these. So that's something to consider, take into consideration. Go with your budget. If all you can afford is an Amazon hammock, good. You know, get out there and enjoy life. If all you can afford is a blue Walmart tarp, great, get that out there and enjoy life with it. You don't have to have these materials to enjoy life. One last thing I want to point out is, in case you see this in the description of the particular tarp that you're looking at, the hydrostatic head, it's measured in millimeters. And what they basically do is they take a piece of material, and they have a tube that's, you know, has measurements on it, and they put water in it and keep adding water until it starts leaking through the other side. So a hydrostatic head of 500 might only hold 500 millimeters of water before it starts leaking through. Now a lot of the tents, especially tents you buy at Walmart or in different places like that, they might only have a hydrostatic head of 500 or 600. And that's also a lot of the cheaper tarps, especially if you start looking at the really, really cheap tarps on Amazon, like $15, you can have a 12-foot tarp. Chances are it's going to have a really low, and they probably won't post it, but it'll have a really low hydrostatic head of like 500 or 600. These tarps, you're talking a hydrostatic head of 3,000, some of them even 4,000 millimeters. So big difference in these cost more, but a big difference in the waterproofness of it. I know when I first started camping 100 years ago, that the tarps, I mean the tents would, the water would kind of start coming through. Some of it was condensation, but a lot of it was actual water soaking through the material and hanging up there on the top of the and sides of the tent. And if you touched it, you'd get all wet. Like I said, some of it was condensation, but some of it was because those cheap tents and tarps have such a low hydrostatic head that the water will start soaking through them and dripping in on the inside. So just wanted to point that out in case you're reading any information that lists the hydrostatic head of the tarp. That's what they're talking about. And I would go with something at least 3,000 to get a good quality tarp that's going to keep you dry. And a lot of those companies like Amazon, those $15 tarps and stuff like that, you're going to find that they don't list that. But that's pretty much what it is, $500 or $600. I mean, a $500 or $600 hydrostatic head, which won't keep you dry in an all-night downpour. You're going to get wet some. And now those blue tarps at Walmart, you can buy one of them for $12 or $15, and they'll keep you dry for a while. But they don't have the UV protection that the sil poly and the sil nylons have. They've got a really great UV protection. The sil poly even a little bit better than the sil nylon. So, but that's it. A lot of information. Video's gone on longer than I hoped it would, but hopefully this will give you a little bit of insight into what you're looking at when you're buying a tarp, and help you make a better educated decision. Like I said, you don't need this fancy stuff to go out and enjoy life. If all you can do is a little blue tarp from Walmart, get out there and have a great time with it.